Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. And I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I hope you're in fighting fit and in great form, because I've got a lovely story for you tonight. And, you know, even though I might sound like a broken record, I always say this and I absolutely mean it. Nothing in this world beats a good story, because you can close your eyes and just tune in. And it's like you're escorted to another part of the world, and you're escorted to a lovely story, and you might become like one of those characters, experiencing some kind of bizarre encounter without even having to leave your house. And what's better than that? And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Roland sighed in disbelief. The heavy sigh travelled from his mouth, down his esophagus into his stomach cavity, where a series of strange gaseous exchanges like nothing he'd ever experienced before appeared to be taking place. He was privately hoping his wife had not heard the squirming sound of his stomach, that wasn't expressing hunger at all, but abject horror at what he was seeing with his naked eye. No wonder they say we feel our emotions in our belly, he thought. In this moment, the emotional feedback he was getting from the house that he'd come to see, courtesy of his wife, was instinctively guttural, almost as if he sensed at once that something was terribly wrong with this place. It was almost as if sinister secrets lurked between the foundations of the house, and were festering in the walls like a crawling parasitic mould. He didn't like the ambience of this house one bit. It screamed sorrow and heartbreak that drilled into his soul like a jackhammer drill, sending prickles of dread coursing down his spine. He wondered how he was supposed to react to this property. By all intents and purposes, he was an easygoing man that didn't allow much to irk him. He wore his heart on his sleeves. This opprobrious mansion represented the kind of sinister abode you'd likely see on a gruesome Stephen King movie. The kind of bodefully oppressive house where all the guests would arrive at the dead of night, be greeted by the sinister caretaker with hollow eyes and a gormless grin, who looks half dead, welcoming you into the jaundiced bowels of the place with a raspy voice, accompanied by a wicked twinkle in his eyes, that suggests that he knows that he's leading you into an insidious trap. And after a night of terror spent in that house, you and the guests would never be seen again, as if in some way the malevolent evil in the house had swallowed the people whole, like a Bermuda Triangle of sorts. He couldn't imagine raising a family in a foreboding mansion like this. Was his wife pulling his strings? The house seemed wrapped up in a tight, clawing, menacing veil, as if even the sunlight had been thwarted from shining down on it. Of course, that could be explained by the lofty trees fringing the house on every side, that looked like monsters with grotesque gnarled limbs. This was the kind of place he was most sure his own children's friends would one day refuse to visit, fearing that the house was haunted by the spirits of the undead. Indeed, if he were a boy again, he would almost certainly avoid staying in a place like this. He could almost imagine lying awake at night, jumping at any sounds, any bang or creak that you might hear in the house, even if it were benign. The worst part of it all was old houses were notorious for having old crotchety bones, so that the staircases creaked and groaned, and the plumbing lightly banged and clattered if a tap was put on in an upstairs bathroom or down in the kitchen. And those ominous clawing sounds would bring life to your nightmares, like a flame to a firework. Was this some kind of joke, he thought? Pray God this was a joke. He allowed himself to cling on to this lost hope that it was, but his wife's face did not look like that of a woman who was about to tell him, "Only joking! As if I'd ever buy a place like this, Roland! You've got to be kidding me! If you must know, it's a haunted location. I thought I'd bring you here for a wind-up, so that for a moment you would really believe we would be shortly moving into this place." Alas, Roland knew that this was no joke on his wife's part. She was deadly serious about this place. "You've got to be kidding." Her besotted expression told him all he needed to know. Had his wife really just purchased this place off the cuff like this for the both of them to live in? He could not see this as a place where you would lay down happy memories and comfortably spread out your roots. It was like a nauseating bad dream that he hoped he'd wake up from. But this was no dream. He was staring at a mansion in complete bewilderment, one that his wife had fully intended to buy. The house brooded there miserably on its sturdy foundations, almost as if basking in its lugubrious melancholia that was so tangibly felt that it chilled Roland to the core of his bones. Something really bad had happened here. Of that he was in absolutely no doubt. And yet his wife seemed blindly immune to the negative energy that the house exuded. It was like she was completely mesmerized by the place, locked under some kind of hypnotic enchanted spell. Could she really not see how dark and austere the house appeared? Granted, it may have looked prepossessing at one point in time, but now it was anything but alluring. It boasted a dark black pitched roof, wrap-around front porches, cylindrical turrets and roof towers, and was built on a sizable woodland property in the Colorado countryside, surrounded by lofty wood groves of very ancient trees that were as old as the house itself. And the countryside was sequestered. It had been left to become wild and untamed, as if the abandoned property had been deserted for a very long time. The windows of the house were riddled with damp and decay, crumbling in their dilapidation, crying out for someone to restore them back to their former glory, like a battle-weary soldier that had been badly injured and needed someone to attend to his wounds. Everywhere you looked, you would see dust, silvery cobwebs that made their home on the outside windows, and rust was bleeding all over the walls of the house and between the surface cracks. Worse still, there was ugly burgeoning creepers growing wildly over the walls, confiscating its beauty by swathing it in a rambunctious tangle of ugly green tentacles, which made it appear all the more glibly menacing. Roland clandestinely suspected that some of this frightfully abhorrent creeper had lightly bludgeoned through the cracks of the ceilings of the house by now, and was crawling along the inside walls. Worse still, the front yard that at one time probably looked spectacularly inviting was now hideously overgrown, with unsightly innocuous weeds and thorny briars, with appendages so sharp they could tear you apart. It was clear to see that where flower beds once proudly stood, showing off a fabulous bouquet of attractive plants, was now just a tangle of hideous weeds and aggressively dominant rambling creepers that stole the space in a haphazard chaos. The house stank of the melancholic abandoned energy of neglect, like something ancient that you find buried in the attic, that's been there for centuries, and you pull it out from among the clutter, and it looks like it's beyond salvaging. Who in their right mind bought a property like this? It was like adopting a badly abused child from an orphanage and trying to invest in something that was so damaged it was beyond help. And even if this old Victorian was restored to its former glory, it did not change the fact that it would do little to erase the darkness, the sombre energy that the house exuded, like a silent, unwelcome message telling you to go away. Roland would be happy to have done just that. Ostensibly, the house his wife has chosen to call the Grey Lady was much like a woman in mourning, who had spent her tragic life wearing the dark clothes of her lamentations. Roland remembered a time when his own grandmother had taken him for tea at her best friend's house, Mrs. Dorothy Pender. The house he had been invited to was a 1950s semi-detached property, which Mrs. Dorothy Pender had just purchased at the time. He recalled how he had been hit with a profound sense of foreboding and an uneasiness that he could not shake off. He had wondered, at such a young, impressionable age, how a house could make him feel like this. The moment he'd entered the property, he'd wanted to leave almost immediately. Later, Roland was to discover from his grandmother Violet, when he told her about the incomprehensible bad vibes he'd experienced at the house while they'd enjoyed tea together, that someone had been murdered in that property. It would seem the previous owner of Mrs. Pender's new house had been shot dead at point-blank range by his own wife, in order for her to gain his life insurance policy. Roland had picked up the macabre energy of the place. His grandmother told him that Dorothy Pender had purchased it for a steal from the estate agents, as naturally no one wanted to live there, in a place clouded by so much tragedy. But Dorothy had had her eye on a bargain, had not been remotely worried about buying the house, if it meant she got it for such a bargain.
"You know what people are like, Violet, dear. They are so overreactive over everything," she'd said to his grandmother. "And, of course, so darn superstitious, if you ask me. So what? Someone was murdered here. Big deal. But the room where it has happened is completely gutted. I don't believe in houses being haunted. That's complete baloney, if you ask me. I'm just lucky that I benefited from people's superstitions. I got the place for practically nothing. What happened here doesn't bother me at all, because it's no longer around. That energy has obviously lifted a long time ago." "Well, rather you than me," Roland's grandmother had told Dorothy, in no uncertain terms. "I couldn't do it myself. Live in a house where someone was murdered. It's just something I wouldn't be able to get my head around, I'm afraid. In my opinion, they should bulldoze places like this, bring them down to the ground, obliterate the bad memories, rebuild again, one brick at a time." Mrs. Pender had made an amused face and chuckled. "Violet, you are such a darn drama queen. You really are. It's just bricks and mortar, for goodness sake. The house is not going to harm me, and there are no ghosts in this place. I can assure you of that." Those were Dorothy Pender's famous last words, as within 12 months of purchasing the property, she had died in unusual idiosyncratic circumstances that was put down to being accidental by the coroner, who suggested she'd taken a nasty tumble down the staircase. Roland thought there was something bad in that house, as even shortly after moving to the place, Mrs. Pender seemed to complain tirelessly of terrible migraine headaches and feelings of nausea that came upon her very suddenly. When Dorothy Pender had died, Roland's grandmother had confessed to him, through teary eyes, "That house killed my dear friend. I know it did. The moment she moved into that place, her life went downhill very fast, as if she was standing on quicksand. My friend lost her joy almost at once. I tried to persuade her that the house was, of course, the source of all her problems, but she refused to believe it. You know how mulishly stubborn she was. Let that be a lesson to you, Roland, dear. Never ever buy a property with bad energy like that. I promise you, houses are like sponges. They absorb energy, and if you're not careful, that contagious energy can drag you down. That's what I believe happened to poor old Dorothy. I'm most sure. I don't believe her fall down the staircase was an accident. Something was in that house. Unfortunately, Dorothy had one Achilles heel. She just loved a bargain, didn't she? She couldn't help herself. Do you know, I remember on one occasion, when she invited me to tea, she proudly announced that the brownies we were eating she had hoisted out of a dumpster outside a bakery. I was appalled. I couldn't believe it, Roland. I went home and heaved up the contents of my stomach. Let me tell you, after hearing that, every time I go to Dorothy's, well, every time I went to Dorothy's for tea, I always made sure that whatever it is she served me up was not something she'd got out of a dumpster. Dorothy Pender had a lot of money, you know, Roland, but she was tight about spending it. And now her love for a bargain has sent her to an early grave. And in my book, that's too high a price to pay.
Don't worry, Grandma, he had assured his grandmother. When I'm older, I'll only live in happy places. I'll never, ever, ever live in a place like Dorothy Pender's. I could never move into a house like hers." As Roland stared at the Victorian house his wife had purchased, he felt nauseously sick, as if he wanted to throw up. He knew if Grandma Violet could see this place, she'd be turning in her grave, screaming at him to run away from this place faster than a March hare. Roland tried to compose himself. He straightened out his 6'8" tall lanky frame to steady himself, and to hold back the guttural distaste of what he was observing, as if trying to suppress the tickle of a sneeze. Never in a million months of Sundays had he expected this, but then he was still learning about his wife, and he had a lifetime to explore her personality, like an uncharted treasure map, and he was looking forward to their journey together as man and wife, which he believed would be an exciting one at that. But Roland knew there were some roller coasters at the fairground you would do well to avoid getting on. Some of his friends at the office had warned him to take it slow when it came to getting married. "How can you marry a woman you've only known for 4 months, Roland?" his business partner Maxwell had told him. "I dated my wife for 8 years before we got hitched." "I don't know," Roland had said, "but when I met Lizelle, I knew she was the one for me. I was mesmerized by her from the word go." "I don't like the sound of that, Roland," said Maxwell scathingly. "Listen to yourself more closely. You're using a word like mesmerized to describe your wife, like a spell thrust upon you from a Harry Potter novel. That's like being so beguiled by someone that you're not really thinking straight when you're making that kind of a commitment. You should always make any lifelong decision with a clear head and your feet on solid ground. I heard somewhere that people who marry their best friends have marriages that last for a lifetime. My wife is my best friend. When it comes to Lizelle, what do you actually know about her, really?" he had said. "I know enough," Roland had said adamantly, "to know that I want to spend my life with her." Maxwell had frowned and looked at his friend obsequiously. "You know what, Roland? You and me, we go back a long time, do we not? You're like a brother to me, not just a best friend. So I would say don't take marriage too lightly. Look at the divorce rates out there these days. They're through the roof. Don't run into something, my friend, before you can walk. That's all I'm saying." Roland was quietly realizing that there were indeed things about his wife he did not know. I mean, if he had known she'd buy a house like this, he would have insisted in having a say on the matter. He had been so sure she'd have chosen a normal house, within the boundaries of what he would consider acceptable. But this outlandish mansion was way off the mark for him, and there was nothing remotely normal about it. If you were buying a haunted location for guests hungry for paranormal experiences and with a desire to be scared out of their wits, investors would be clever to buy a place like this. But to buy a place like this to live in as a family home, Roland would be laughing if it wasn't so damn tragic. As for that wood grove, with the tall gnarled trees that looked like menacious monsters, the property appeared insidiously menacing and very unwelcoming as far as Roland was concerned. He had married his wife Lizelle after a passionate 4-month love affair when he met her on an ocean liner. He felt as if he'd won the lottery, he was so happy. Lizelle looked animated as she stared at the house that she had bought. She had brought Roland along to see it, with a blindfold on him, before she drove him up to the house in her SUV. He had guessed the house was situated in a rather remote area, as the truck his wife had been driving had been precariously bumping over jolts and crevices in the road. "You're going to love the house, Roland," she told him, with great conviction in her voice. "And wait until I tell you the stories connected to the place. It'll keep you awake at night, it will. Put it this way, it's almost like we're going to be living in our own fairy tale castle." Roland had chuckled. "Why don't I like the sound of this, Lizelle?" said Roland uneasily. "You're making me rather nervous. What on earth have you bought for us?" "If you're worried about the money, Roland, there's no need to be. Hold your horses.
The house I've chosen for us is well within the budget you gave me. I was able to buy the place at a bargain. Moreover, the structural engineer has assured me that although the house is run down and unkept, it is built on solid foundations and is structurally very sound. They don't make houses like this today. That's why properties like this are a sound investment. Well, that's what he told me anyway. And although I agree, I'm no expert on properties, I will admit that. But you can see the house has strong bones. At one glance, I'm sure you will realise that. When Roland had heard the house was old, that his wife had purchased, he suspected it was a ranch-style property and needed a little tender loving care. But he had never envisaged his wife buying an old Victorian mansion that needed gutting on the inside. He was sure he'd be a long time before he and his wife could actually move into the place. This old mansion needed more than just a facelift. It probably needed a Catholic exorcist to cast out the foreboding gloom that hung around the place like a suffocating choker chain of pearls around a lady's neck. Lizelle had parked the truck on the overgrown driveway, opened up the passenger side door, and led out her blindfolded husband by the hand over some bumpy crevices in the ground, and then released the blindfold from his eyes as Roland had stood there stupefied as he gawped at the house with a gobsmacked expression on his face. "Look at you!" Lizelle had giggled. "You look so shocked, Roland." "I know. Isn't it absolutely marvellous? Have you ever seen anything quite so spectacular? It's probably taken your breath right away as it did mine when I first laid my eyes on it. I can hardly believe this house is ours, and I found it for us. I feel as if I've won the lottery, like when I met you, Roland. Isn't it absolutely gorgeous?" Lizelle's eyes were burning brightly with an irrepressible ebullient enthusiasm. She almost danced in front of the grey lady, delighting in showing Roland their brand new home. Indeed, she was so spirited, so chuffed, so abounding with a bountiful joy, like a kid in a candy shop, riveted by all the yummy sweets on display. Roland knew he'd feel like a prize prat if he was to rob his wife of her obvious joy by being such a killjoy and expressing his extreme misgivings about the property that his wife had not only chosen, but bought with his consent. How could he complain about the place when he had gladly given his wife carte blanche to buy the property she liked for the both of them? "Really," she'd said to him at the time, "you're going to let me choose where we live? Buy the house of my dreams? Even if you don't see it? Why would you do that, Roland?" Roland had reached out to take his wife's hand. "Because I love the bones of you, Lizelle. I want to make you deliriously happy if I can. And it's a privilege as your husband to give my wife her heart's desires, if of course it is within my grasp to be able to do so. Everybody knows in relationships we have to make sacrifices in order to make each other happy. I know you will choose the quintessential perfect place for us to raise a family together. So the decision about what house you buy is entirely your decision. Besides, I'd like to be surprised when I sign the legal documents for the property. I enjoy being surprised. In truth, I'm indifferent about where we actually live. As long as I'm with you, that's all that matters. That is what will make me happy." Lizelle had looked at her husband adoringly, with her warm eyes the colour of honeyed treacle, and said, "Where did I find you, Roland Peterson? I knew when I first laid eyes on you that you were a keeper." Roland had chuckled and said, "It's no big deal. Where we live, that's not a problem for me. As I said, I'm leaving the decisions to you. Everything is in your hands. Besides, house hunting is a pretty boring thing to do, when there are a lot more interesting things to be doing with my time. I've also got a lot of deadlines to meet at my offices in Denver. And besides, I am in no doubt you have great taste." When Roland had said that to his wife, could he really say she had great taste, when he didn't really know her that well? But if this house was anything to go by, taste she clearly had not. He had envisaged something so different to this, when he'd been signing the deeds for the property with his wife. Before seeing it for himself, he had trusted her so much to make a savvy choice. But this house looked like something the bowels of the earth had purged up, like a deadly toxic mushroom that needed to be bulldozed at once.
Roland, you've been awfully quiet since we got here. You haven't answered my question yet. What do you think about the Grey Lady? Asked Lizelle, her eyes shining brightly. Isn't she wonderful? Absolutely wonderful. They called the house the Grey House, but I changed it to the Grey Lady. It's so much more apt. She's so beautiful, isn't she? Have you ever seen anything so charmed in your entire life? Roland could think of a whole lot of things more significantly beautiful than this dingy, grandiose old Victorian mansion. Roland blinked and inwardly grimaced as he awkwardly chewed his lip, trying his level best to hide his extreme displeasure from his wife. Did his wife seriously expect them to live here? The place was as oppressive as a mortuary. It almost looked anorexic and emaciated from the wear and tear of time, which gave the Grey Lady a skeletal, rather beleaguered look, as if she had no meat on her bones. It had not escaped his attention that the wood on the wraparound porch was so warped it had rotted all away. "You're still in shock, aren't you?" Lizelle giggled. "Bless you, Roland. I can see you're as thrilled as I am. When the estate agent took me here to the Grey Lady, I passed out on the spot. I was so enamoured with the place. The poor man, he had to run in the house to get me some water. He kept asking me if I was all right. I said to him, all right, all right. You don't understand. I've just died and gone to heaven. Of course I'm all right. This place is amazing." "I mean, yes, it needs a lot of work," said Lizelle, giggling, "but I'm prepared to put in all the tender, loving care into the place to bring the Grey Lady back to shape. It's so sad the place has been so neglected for so long. But that's all about to change. The old girl is about to have a makeover that will turn her into a goddess. I cannot believe anyone would abandon a place like this. Do you know, no one has touched this place in years. It's been on the market at the estate agents, I'm told, for over 20 years, and there's been no buyers to date until now, until I came along. It seems we are the only people that can see the potential in this place. It oozes opportunity that others have failed to see. But their loss is our gain." Roland cleared his throat. "Why has it been on the market for so long?" he asked. "Did the estate agent say why it wasn't selling? I always thought old Victorian properties were highly sought after, and if this house really got the thumbs up from the structural engineer, why did it not sell? You would think some fixer-up would have invested in this place a long time ago, to sell for a sizable profit, would you not?" "I know! It's crazy, isn't it? Completely nonsensical," said Lizelle impassionately. "What's wrong with people? This place should have been swept up the moment it came on the market. The estate agent practically fainted when I told him I wanted to buy the house. He thought I'd be put off by the history. I mean, really, as if I would be." Roland interjected very swiftly before his wife had time to finish her sentence. "What did the estate agent tell you about the history of this house?" he asked, sensing that the history might explain the disagreeable energy of the home. "Oh, didn't I say?" said Lizelle nonchalantly. "Well, apparently in the 1800s, the owner of this house, a man called Oliver Bennett, claimed his wife Eleanor Bennett had gone missing. She went into the woods on this property one day and never returned home. The owner claimed there was a monster in the woods that had taken his wife away. He said he'd seen the monster himself before and had tried to chase it off the property a few times by firing after it. It would seem it wasn't remotely intimidated by his shotgun, and his bullets kept missing the target every time. The monster kept coming back to the property like a dog to its vomit. He said the creature was demonical, with red eyes, standing up on 2 feet like a man. His wife claimed that she had been stalked by the creature, which she described was a wolf-like humanoid. On many occasions she told her husband she had noticed the creature staring at her from the trees. She believed the creature was after her, but Mr. Bennett told her that as scary as the creature was, if it did intend to harm her, it would have done so a long time ago. She didn't agree, of course. She said, "But you don't understand. He's biding his time, I know he is. But he wants me," she told him. "I know he does. I feel it in my bones. He'll grab me when the time is right.
I know he will, and you'll never ever see me again. You have to kill him, Oliver, or this thing will get me." "I'll do my level best to kill him for you," her husband had told her. But every time he tried to fire, the thing fled like the wind. He tried to persuade his wife that her worries were unfounded, even though the creature was incredibly intimidating. "But what if it's a demon?" his wife had asked him. "That might be the reason you can't kill it, Oliver. Your bullets keep missing their target. You're a great shot normally, Oliver. It makes no sense to me that you cannot take this insidious beast down." "It's not a demon," Oliver assured his wife. "But I will admit, whatever it is not of this world. I've never seen anything like it." On the day that his wife mysteriously vanished, Oliver noticed the creature's tracks in the ground, as after the recent rainfall to the area, the imprints of a gargantuan-sized wolf-like humanoid were clear to be seen. Oliver Bennett knew without a shadow of a doubt that this insidious beast had been responsible for abducting his wife, who was nowhere to be found. But the police were called on the scene to search for her anyway, but no trace of her could be recovered. Mr. Bennett showed them the huge wolf-like tracks in the ground that seemed to belong to a very sizable animal, walking upright on 2 feet, which astounded the police investigators, who only had one word to say on the matter: "What the hell?" They could not make sense of the enigmatic imprints, but they assumed that Oliver Bennett's wife had been savagely attacked by a wild animal, and that was the end of the matter. The bereaved Oliver Bennett was so incredibly devastated about his wife's disappearance. He spent years in the woodgrove, on the property of the Grey Lady, hunting for the creature everywhere, but it eluded him all the time. He'd find the creature's imprints in the ground, sense he was being watched, see a flash of red eyes in his peripheral vision, smell the repugnant stench of death and decay that he knew belonged to the wolf-like beast, the smell that made you want to heave up the contents of your stomach and cause your eyes to physically burn, as if you'd had acid flung at your face. Mr. Bennett was never able to find the creature. He was certain the enigmatic, mysterious beast was feeding off his anger, enjoying his grief, like you might luxuriate in a hot bubble bath. It was an impression he got, as whenever he returned to the house after searching for the creature, the following day he could not get out of bed. He was so emotionally spent. It was like all his energy had been sucked out of him, like the milkshake from a straw. His health soon declined after the exhaustion ensued. It would seem Oliver Bennett tragically died with a broken heart, in this house, the Grey Lady, devastated that he could not right the wrong by killing the elusive wolf-like humanoid that he knew literally had killed and abducted his own wife. Oliver Bennett had one daughter and a son, both affirming that they both had witnessed the monster, who was fixated over their mother for reasons unknown. There was a write-up in the paper about it at the time, with a title which read, "Colorado man Oliver Bennett believes his wife Eleanor Bennett was abducted and lightly killed by a wolf-like humanoid, a bipedal standing on 2 feet, that had been stalking for her for a very long time, watching her from the woods on their property, smelling as repugnant as a decomposing corpse. Mr. Bennett told the paper that the whole family, including his son Earl and his daughter Charlotte, had seen the intimidating beast with their very own eyes. They claimed the creature stood up on 2 legs at 8 foot tall, was thin and emaciated, with ribs sticking out from the torso, and patches of mange dispersed over its cropped brown short hair. For a while we thought the creature was a demon," they told the paper, "but I assure you it was real." Charlotte got a close-up view of the creature, described it as almost mocking her. "It was laughing at me. I know it was. It had so much drool, dribbling down its jaws, and 2 rows of jagged canine teeth. When it saw me, it began thrashing its tail like an agitated dog. I was so terrified," she explained. "I ran away from the thing, screaming my lungs out to full capacity, but it never gave me chase. When I looked back over my shoulders, it was just standing where I last saw it, staring at me. And as crazy as this may sound, it really did seem to be laughing at me. I knew it was enjoying putting the fear of God into my soul." Mr. Oliver Bennett went on to say, "I have even found places in the woodgrove where the thing has been nesting among the carcasses of wild animals, and it smells so foul, like nothing on this earth. I have tried to kill the beast. It has eluded me every time, for it seems to pirouette away from my bullets, moving faster than the wind in its escape. Believe me, there are things out there that defy man's grasp and understanding, but I've seen these things myself. I can affirm to the doubting Thomases out there, and to the disbelievers, that monsters do indeed exist. They are not fables conjured up by mythical stories told to us by our grandparents, passed down through the generations as fireside stories or fables. They are, in my humble opinion, based on hardened facts, where hunters from the past, sometimes on their solo journeys in the wilderness, encountered seemingly mythical beasts in the wooded labyrinths of Colorado, for we have heard many stories of these accounts. As to what this mythical beast is, I cannot say, but it takes the words ugly and grotesque to a whole new level, for nothing in my ability to describe this demonical beast would do it justice. I have retired from my pursuit of this thing, as it delights in my inability to catch it. It feeds off my energy like a succubus, to such an extent that for days afterwards I am so fatigued I can barely keep my eyes open. So there we are. That is the end of part 1. Isn't it exciting? I look forward to you joining me tomorrow for part 2. Until next time, goodbye and good night.